Hi, I'm Willem Lang from Wildlife Journal. The folks at New Hampshire Public Television and I thought you might enjoy seeing some of New Hampshire's most beautiful places. We're going to show you 6 of them this evening, and we're going to save the very best for last. That sound pretty good to you? Does to me too. Problem is, of course, there are just so many wonderful places to see in this state. The mountains, the lakes region, the sea coast. Where do we start? Which of all these beautiful places is the best, the crown jewel? Well, I do love water, and I do love fishing, and I love canoeing. So considering all those factors, and after consultation with my resident outdoor expert, Tucker here, we're going to go first to the Esther Currier Wildlife Management Area, and then to Panema Bog, and finally we're going to take a look at a couple of interesting rivers, the Kentucket and the Pemigewasset. And now maybe you've been to some of these places before, maybe not, but there's one thing for sure, every one of them is worth a closer look. Currier is kind of an interesting place. All the old maps call it low plain natural area. Doesn't look much like a plain though, does it? But that's probably what it has been, off and on, ever since people first moved into this country. The first English settlers here had to survive by farming, by growing enough to feed their families and livestock, and maybe even trade a little for stuff they couldn't make or grow. Areas like this weren't very attractive to them. The swamp hay would keep a cow alive, but it was pretty poor feed compared to what they could grow once they cleared drier ground. They hunted waterfowl here in season, but that didn't have much impact on the land. Once they trapped out the beaver and muskrat, the settlers left this low, wet land pretty much alone. There is a pretty interesting glacial feature here at Currier. If you follow the Davis Path along the east side of the pond, you're walking on an esker. Eskers are fascinating. They're the remains of rivers that used to flow through crevasses inside glaciers. The ice walls confined the water, and later when they melted, the bed of the river, all that gravel and sand that it washed down, was left behind as a sinuous ridge of gravel. They're a little hard to see sometimes in New England because they're all covered with trees. There's what's called a quaking bog here too. It looks like plain old soggy ground, but it's really just plants and grass and tamarack trees growing on a mat of semi-floating moss. If you stand still, you can feel the vibration of somebody walking hundreds of feet away. Even the tamaracks tremble to a nearby footstep. I think they're one of our loveliest native trees, sort of prehistoric looking and lose their needles in the winter. But first they turn a bright gold and yellow, and partridge love to forage in the branches. The beavers came back to the low plain about 40 years ago and dammed up Chandler Brook at the outlet of the pond. They're pretty active here. If you sit quiet in one of the duck blinds, you can watch them at work. As a kid, I thought that's all they did, work, like honeybees, you know. And then one day, many years ago now, I sat in a canoe in the pouring rain and watched 4 of them playing Catch Me If You Can for about 20 minutes. Then one of them popped up right beside the canoe, and we were eyeball to eyeball for maybe 2 seconds. And then, pow, with his tail. Game was over. The Courier is a beautiful place. Come when you have plenty of time. And bring a lunch. Whenever I mention the word bog to a certain friend of mine, all he can think of is Sherlock Holmes and the Hound of the Baskervilles. But what is a bog anyway? Well, it's the darndest collection of flora and fauna that you'll ever see swimming around in an anaerobic soup, meaning no oxygen available. Now, the bog I'm thinking of doesn't have any Sherlock Holmes characters sneaking around. At Ponema Bog, all you'll find is 75 acres of pure delight. Ponema Bog. Sounds like an Indian word, doesn't it? Well, it's supposed to. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow made it up, as far as I know. He used it in his poem Hiawatha to mean land of the hereafter. Somebody here in New Hampshire quite a long while ago must have liked the sound of it and gave it to this bog. But it doesn't fit. Bogs have more to do with the past than the future. This bog started out as a chunk of ice that broke off the last continental ice sheet when it retreated about 15,000 years ago. The weight of the ice grinds away the rock beneath it and produces amazing amounts of gravel and sand and silt. All that stuff flushes out of the glacier in streams of meltwater that can be hundreds of feet deep, deep enough to cover those broken off chunks of ice. Over the years, that ice slowly melts. As it does, the gravel slumps into the hole and it fills with water. What's left is called a kettle. The edges are slowly filling in with peat and floating sphagnum moss. You stay on the boardwalks, you can get pretty close to the pond. The trees here aren't what you normally find in this neck of the woods. We're used to maple and ash and beech and oak and birch and popple. Soft woods, pretty much white pine, hemlock, spruce, and balsam. But here, the first trees moving into the bog are water willows and soft maple, and 3 scrubby little conifers, pitch pine, black spruce, and tamarack. The plants here are different too. Bogs, being quite acidic, are very low in nutrients, so the plants that grow here can't get their nourishment through their roots. Instead, they get it out of the air. And they go after the most abundant food resource in the air, insects. The pitcher plant and bladderworts and sundew have evolved aromas that are attractive to bugs. They land on the plants expecting something sweet. Instead, they get trapped and digested. Not many mammals get very close to bogs, except for maybe muskrats and human beings looking for places to dig peat, as they did here 60 years ago. Most wild mammals have the same attraction we do for solid ground. So, except for the hum of insects and the songs of birds that live on insects and the soft flutter of dragonflies, bogs are pretty quiet and peaceful. Perfect place to spend a few hours on a long, sunny afternoon. Now, a bog is one thing, but rivers are a whole lot of things happening all together, all at once. They're cantankerous, complicated, fun, and surprising. A lot like people, actually. The Kentucket and Pemigewasset are prime examples of this, and here's why. This is a tale of 2 rivers. They're both entirely within New Hampshire. They're both 70 miles long. They both flow into the Merrimack River and together into the Atlantic at Newburyport, Massachusetts. They both have long, meandering stretches of flat water and lazy current, and they both have faster stretches that range all the way up to what whitewater boaters call Class 5 rapids, meaning almost impossible to get through in a closed canoe or kayak right side up. They both flow through some of New Hampshire's most beautiful country. But there the similarities end. The Pemigewasset River rises in Profile Lake up in Franconia Notch, right beneath the famous symbol that gave the lake its name, the Old Man of the Mountains. From there it flows pretty much due south till it meets the Winnipesaukee at Franklin and becomes the Merrimack. The Kentucket rises in southern New Hampshire in the town of Rindge, just about 100 miles from Profile Lake. From there it wanders northeast and flows finally into the Merrimack just above Concord. The Kentucket, because of its unique flow to the northeast, was a popular travel route for Native Americans and later the settlers. Hundreds of years later, we still haven't been able to build a major east-west highway across the grain of northern New England. Almost everything here runs north and south. Another big difference is in their power. The Kentucky drains about 700 square miles, mostly south of the mountains, and drops an average of only 10 feet per mile. The Pemmy drains 1,000 square miles and drops almost 24 feet per mile. So when it's in flood, it can cause quite a bit of excitement downstream. What's called the Upper Kentucky is the stretch from its headwater pond all the way to Hillsboro. It's pretty small and steep, so most canoeists start a few miles down at Cheshire Pond. Below Hillsboro are the famous freight train rapids. You can tell they're coming because there's 3 miles of quiet water first, meaning something's holding the water back. After Freight Train, the Kentucky River ends very peacefully with the Deadwater where it flows into the Merrimack. The Pemigewasset, by contrast, is bigger, more scenic, and much more powerful. 18th century millwrights hiked or poled up the river looking for waterfalls high enough for power and bedrock solid enough for their dam's foundations. Their water wheels were eventually superseded by turbines and steam power, but their beautiful stonework remains here and there. In places, you can almost imagine you're paddling past medieval ruins in Europe. The most spectacular drop in the Pemmy is at Livermore Falls, about 4 miles below West Campton. There's a 50-foot cascade there over a dam with a gorge down below. You don't want to go over that dam, but you do want to stop and look for an unusual rock. It's a dark-colored igneous rock, but you won't find much of it lying around. You'll see it in the cliffs beside the falls. It runs through the lighter-colored granite in what are called dikes, kind of like veins of chocolate in a marble cake. Some inquisitive geologist discovered it here in 1879 and named it Camptonite. This occurrence was thought to be unique in the world, but shoot, since then they've found it in Russia, India, France, the Orkney Islands, and Winooski, Vermont. For a while there, we thought New Hampshire had something nobody else had, besides the old man, that is. A mile or so below the bridge in Bristol, the Smith River comes in on the right. Even if you're in a hurry, you ought to park here for a while and hike up to Profile Falls. It's only about a quarter of a mile, and the falls is spectacular. Below the Smith River, it's easy going the rest of the way. After one last dam in the middle of Franklin, there's another mile of rapids and a stretch of still water before the Pemmy joins the Winnipesaukee and becomes the head of the Merrimack. On both sides of the river are high sand and gravel banks that were once the bottom of a large post-glacial lake held back by a natural dam where Manchester is now. It's kind of pleasant to imagine how this place must have looked 10,000 years ago. Caribou along the banks, salmon swarming up the rapids, subarctic vegetation just beginning to take hold, people, if any, just nomadic hunters. I can't help but wonder if it'll ever be like that again. I'm headed out first thing tomorrow morning for Connecticut Lakes. Just trying to get a few things ready to go. Next up is Pondicherry Wildlife Refuge. I could go to Pondicherry 100 times and never see everything. I try to remember when I go to a place like that nature is putting on a show just for me. Curtains up, I got an orchestra seat, and all I got to do is enjoy it. If you ever take a commuter flight over New Hampshire, one of the first things you'll notice is how rocky it is. Not for nothing is it called the Granite State. Next thing you'll notice is how many ponds there are, dozens and dozens of them. A lot of them are little deep, cold water ponds with rock ledges for shores, but even more of them are shallow and surrounded by swamps and the snags of old dead trees. Oftentimes, ponds drain in two directions when there's plenty of water. But over time, one outlet dominates and eventually steals all the water. The cherry ponds are like that. This used to be woodland caribou country. Indians hunted them here about 800 years ago. Oh, I wish I could have seen it then. The view from the north shore of Big Cherry Pond is spectacular. In the foreground, you've got floating islands, the sphagnum moss, where loons and red-winged blackbirds nest. Beyond the pond lie the swamp and the snags of thousands of dead trees, birds everywhere, warblers, thrushes, woodpeckers, northern harriers. Obviously a great place to raise kids with feathers. Then beyond the swamp, the land starts to rise. There's Cherry Mountain just in the foreground, and then the whole sweep of the northern presidentials, Madison, Adams, Jefferson, and Washington. Thousands of hikers trek that skyline every year on the Appalachian Trail, and it's a safe bet that virtually none of them realize what a natural treasure they're looking down on if they turn their gaze to the northwest. I've never seen more than one other person here. Last time it was a bird watcher, by the look of him. Binoculars, notebook, little lunch bag. Very quiet person, as bird watchers tend to be. They wouldn't see many birds otherwise. Here the birds seem almost tame and undisturbed. It's a far cry nowadays from the shouts of loggers and the whistles of steam trains that used to echo off the hills. For all of us, humans, birds, and wild animals, it's a refuge in every sense of the word. You probably noticed the ridge of the Presidentials up behind Cherry Mountain. Way up there, on the top of a cliff above King Ravine, is an old camp named Crag Camp. A couple of friends of mine and I spent the night up there some years ago. It was a dark, stormy, cold night, and I was tired, sleeping like a log in there. Well, about the middle of the night, somebody got up to go outside for a few minutes, and when he come back in, it sounded as though somebody else came back in with him. Whoever it was ran right across the floor of the camp and jumped up on my bunk with me. I kind of fell around. I was half asleep. God, it was a woman. Long hair, cold, wet, shivering. So I took some of my sleeping bag and put it over her, and I went back to sleep. Hours later, morning came. I woke up. I could tell that she enjoyed and appreciated having spent the night with me because she licked my face. It was a Springer Spaniel. Well, seeing these flies reminds me that nowadays just catching fish is enough sport for me. I let them go. I don't need to take them home anymore. Besides, as the late Lee Wolf used to say, a really good fish is too valuable to catch only once. A couple of my favorite spots to do this are Nubanusset Lake and Spoonwood Pond. The scenery is great, the fishing is spectacular, and I always come home happy. Here's why. Nubanusset Lake sits right in the middle of a skinny triangle formed by Concord and Manchester, New Hampshire, and Brattleboro, Vermont, kind of in the jaws of a population nutcracker. And it's not a natural pond either, so it's quite a surprise to see how relatively unspoiled it is. Nubanusset is one of the deepest ponds in New Hampshire, up to 96 feet. So it's got warm water fish in the shallows and 3 different kinds of trout down in the cold layers. It used to be called Long Pond till somebody, most likely a summer resident, pushed to restore its original Indian name, Nubanusset. Sounds kind of like a summer camp for city kids, doesn't it? It's an Abenaki word, supposed to mean either where we go in the summer or the lake at the southern boundary of our territory. A few years before the Civil War, the mills in Harrisville were having trouble operating during the summer months. So the owners dammed up Spoonwood Pond, made a pretty good body of water out of it, 3/4 of a mile long, 66 feet deep. That helped a lot. But then came the war, and with the increased demand for wool uniforms and blankets, it wasn't enough. So they dammed up Long Pond too. That must have been enough. They won the war. Today, there's a short portage between the two ponds, maybe 150 feet. Dubanusset has an access ramp up near its north end and 643 acres of beautiful water for boating or fishing. A lovely place. Now, Spoonwood. Spoonwood is one of those ponds that first time you see it, you say, I'm coming back here. The water is clear as glycerin with bass and perch cruise in the shallows as your canoe passes by. It's like an aquarium. This is a place where you need to pitch a tent and experience at least one full 24-hour cycle. The pond, unlike most others around here, is reverting to nature. It's quiet. The fishing is excellent, and your neighbors, bird, fish, or human, are of only the very finest sort. Ah yes, a beautiful spot. It needs only one more image as far as I'm concerned to be perfect. Me, sitting beside the pond with a cup of coffee on an evening in May, watching the trout rise and listening to the calls of the loons. My hands-down favorite of all the places we visited with Wildlife Journal is Nash Stream State Forest. It's the jewel in the crown in my book. And after you see what I'm talking about, maybe it'll be yours too. A lot of New Hampshire's beautiful places are little gems, you know, that have been saved from development all around them. But Nash Stream State Forest is a big gem, 40,000 acres, and it's my favorite place to visit whenever I get the chance. The country here is rugged, very mountainous. You come at it from the south, first thing you notice is the two Percy Peaks sticking up out of the woods, only a little more than 3,000 feet high. Once you drive on upstream past the Percy Peaks, you've got mountains on both sides, and little brooks, each pitching in its 2 cents worth. Reminds me of the streams I fished as a kid, with old sneakers, a long pole, a can of worms, and a willow creel. There's not a lot of civilization around it. Groveton and Colebrook to the west and Stark to the south. People from away sometimes think they're in the forest primeval here in Nash Stream. Not quite. These woods were pretty well logged off 100 years ago, and they were full of men and horses all winter, till the spring thaw in April melted the bottom out of the road. Quite something to think of all the racket and activity that used to fill this quiet valley. There's nothing like Nash Stream State Forest to remind us that New Hampshire is one beautiful state. And there's nothing like New Hampshire Public Television keeping you in mind by giving us the best seats in the house to enjoy it. Well, I hope you enjoyed what you saw this evening. And don't forget, the best part of being outdoors is you never know what's going to happen next, especially if you think you do. I'm Willem Lang, and I'll see you outdoors.